The Onion is a website. It's a parody website that used to be funny. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of The Onion, but there was a glorious time in our history in which not everything had to be a political side. Sometimes you could just have content that was entertaining or fun or funny, and it didn't have to be Trump or Biden. Like, it didn't have to be anything other than present. And the Onion hasn't been there for a long, long time, but they've done something actually useful. A man who was arrested over a Facebook parody aimed at his local police department is trying to take his case to the Supreme Court. He has sought help from an unlikely source, which filed a friend of the court, amicus, brief on Monday. Americans can be put in jail for poking fun at the government, the brief asked. This was a surprise to America's finest news source and an uncomfortable learning experience for its editorial team. The source is, of course, The Onion. Let's read The Onion's brief real quick. It's not normal that you get to read a brief that's interesting. This one's actually interesting. This is a real brief by The Onion, a real amicus brief that they have filed. The Onion is the world's leading news publication, offering highly acclaimed, universally revered coverage of breaking national, international, and local news events. Rising from its humble beginnings as a print newspaper in 1756, The Onion now enjoys a daily readership of 4.3 trillion and has grown into the single most powerful and influential organization in human history. In addition to maintaining a towering standard of excellence to which the rest of the industry aspires, The Onion supports more than 350,000 full and part-time journalism jobs in its numerous news bureaus and manual labor camps stationed around the world. And members of its editorial board have served with distinction in an advisory capacity for such nations as China, Syria, Somalia, and the former Soviet Union. On top of its journalistic pursuits, The Onion also owns and operates the majority of the world's transoceanic shipping lanes, stands on the nation's leading edge on matters of deforestation and strip mining, and proudly conducts tests on millions of animals daily. The Onion's keen, fact-driven reportage has been cited favorably by one or more local courts, as well as Iran and the Chinese state-run media. Footnote: no counsel for any party authored this brief in whole or in part. No counsel or party made a momentary contribution intended to fund the preparation or submission of this brief. Timely notice of the intent to file this amicus brief was provided to all parties, and all parties have consented to the filing of this brief. Along the way, The Onion's journalists have garnered a sterling reputation for accuracy forecasting future events. One such coup was The Onion's scoop, revealing that a former president kept nuclear secrets strewn around his beach home's basement 3 years before it even happened. And they got a footnote to a 2017 headline. See Mar-a-Lago assistant manager wondering if anyone coming to collect nuclear briefcase from Lost and Found. The Onion, March 27, 2017. It's kind of funny. Like, that's kind of funny that they wrote that article in 2017. It was the new codes. The Onion files this brief to protect its continued ability to create fiction that may ultimately merge into reality. As the Globe's premier parodists, the Onion's writers also have a self-serving interest in preventing political authorities from imprisoning humorists. This brief is submitted in the interest of at least mitigating their future punishment. Introduction and summary of argument. Americans can be put in jail for poking fun at the government. This was a surprise to America's finest news source and an uncomfortable learning experience for its editorial team. Indeed, quote, Ohio police officers arrest, prosecute man who made fun of them on Facebook might sound like a headline ripped from the front pages of The Onion, albeit one that's considerably less amusing because its subjects are real. So, when The Onion learned about the Sixth Circuit's ruling in the case, it became justifiably concerned. First, the obvious. The Onion's business model was threatened. This was only the latest occasion on which the absurdity of actual events managed to eclipse what the Onion staff could make up. Much more of this in the front page of The Onion would be indistinguishable from the New York Times. Second, The Onion regularly pokes its finger in the eyes of repressive and authoritarian regimes such as the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and domestic presidential administrations. So The Onion's professional parodists were less than enthralled to be confronted with a legal ruling that fails to hold government actors accountable for jailing and prosecuting a would-be humorist simply for making fun of them. Third, the Sixth Circuit's ruling imperils an ancient form of discourse. The court's decision suggests that parodists are in the clear only if they pop the balloon in advance by warning their audience that their parody is not true. But some forms of comedy don't work unless the comedian is able to tell the joke with a straight face. Parody is a quintessential example. Parodists intentionally inhabit the rhetorical form of their target in order to exaggerate or implode it, and by doing so, demonstrate the target's illogic or absurdity. Put simply, for parody to work, it has to plausibly mimic the original. The Sixth Circuit's decision in this case would condition the First Amendment's protection for parody upon a requirement that parodists explicitly say up front that their work is nothing more than an elaborate fiction. But that would strip parody of the very thing that makes it function. And we've seen this. You've seen this requirements not from government, but from private companies like Facebook, Twitter, or whatever. This is a parody account. You have to tell people it's a parody account, right? Because people are like, this is happening. It's like, no, you idiots. But you should examine why you think it's true. You should examine why you think it's true that a police department is saying such ridiculous things, because maybe there's a problem with police department communications on social media. That's the point of parody. That's the point of satire. That's the point of the whole genre of comedy. And it is really fucking critically important, because if you just say parody for everything, then there's no point to the parody. Parody is supposed to look real enough to make you question whether it is. The Onion cannot stand idly by in the face of a ruling that threatens to disembowel a form of rhetoric that has existed for millennia, that is particularly potent in the realm of political debate, and that purely incidentally forms the basis of the Onion's writers' paychecks. Here's why this brief is so fucking good, though. Because this brief is a mockery of the Supreme Court and amicus briefs. Like, its form and function have merged into a perfect entity. It's mocking the very thing that it's seriously participating in right now. They're doing parody for the court, but also like totes serious, bro. And it's great. It's great. Parody functions by tricking people into thinking that it's real. Tu stultus es. You are dumb. These three Latin words have been the Onion's motto and guiding light since it was founded in 1988 as America's finest news source, leading its writers towards the paper's singular purpose of pointing out that its readers are deeply gullible people. The Onion's motto is central to this brief for two important reasons. First, it's Latin, and the Onion knows that the federal judiciary is staffed entirely by total Latin dorks. This is actually true. They quote Catullus in the original Latin in chambers. They sweetly whisper, stare decisis, into their spouse's ears. They mutter, cui bono, underneath their breath while picking up after their neighbor's dogs. So the Onion knew that unless it pointed to a suitably Latin rallying cry, its brief would be operating far outside the court's vernacular. The second reason, perhaps mildly more important, is that the phrase "you are dumb" captures the very heart of parody, tricking readers into believing that they're seeing a serious rendering of some specific form, a pop song lyric, a newspaper article, a police beat, and then allowing them to laugh at their own gullibility when they realize that they've fallen victim to one of the oldest tricks in the history of rhetoric. See San Francisco Bay Guardian Inc. versus Superior Court. The very nature of parody is to catch the reader off guard at first glance, after which the victim recognizes that the joke is on him and the extent that it caught him unaware. It really is an old trick. The word parody stretches back to the Hellenic word. It originates in the prefix para, meaning an alteration, and the suffix ode, referring to the poetry form known as an ode. Oxford English Dictionary Online is a citation there. One of its earliest practitioners was a 1st century BC poet Horace, whose satires would replicate the exact form known as an ode, mimicking its meter, its subject matter, even its self-serious tone, but tweaking it ever so slightly that the form was able to mock its own idiocies. He cites Horace, Satires, Epistles, and Ars Poetica. This is not a mere linguistic anecdote. The point is instead that without the capacity to fool someone, parody is functionally useless, deprived of the tools inscribed in its very etymology that allow it again and again to perform this rhetorically powerful sleight of hand. It adopts a particular form in order to critique it from within. See Farah versus Esquire magazine. Parody leverages the expectations that are created in readers when they see something written in a particular form. This could be anything, but for the sake of brevity, let's assume that it's a newspaper headline, maybe one written by The Onion, that begins in this familiar way. Supreme Court rules. Already one can see how this works as a parodic setup. leading readers to think that they're reading a newspaper story. With just 3 words, The Onion has mimicked the dry tone of an Associated Press news story, aping the clipped syntax and the subject matter. The Onion could go even further by putting that headline on its website, which features a masthead and Latin motto, and the design of which parodies the aesthetics of major news sites, further selling the idea that this is an actual news story. Of course, what moves this into the realm of parody is when The Onion completes the headline with the punchline, the thing that mocks the newspaper format. The Onion could do something like this: Supreme Court rules, Supreme Court rules. This actually happened back in 1997. The Onion could push the parody even further by writing the joke out in article format with, say, a quote from the justices in the majority opining that while the U.S. Constitution guarantees equality of power among the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, it most definitely does not guarantee equality of coolness. And rounding off by reporting the Supreme Court's holding that the court rules and rules totally and all worthy and touched by nobody in perpetuity and in accordance with the Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. The ability of the president and Congress to keep pace with us is not only separate, but most unequal. You know what's funny about this? Back in 1997, they wrote this. The Supreme Court actually fucking did this in Marbury versus Madison. They did this. Onion nailed him on it. As can be seen, the Associated Press form is followed straight through into the article. That rhetorical form sets up the reader's expectations for how the idiom will play out, expectations that are jarringly juxtaposed with the content of the article. The power of the parody arises from that dissonance into which the reader has been drawn, citing Farah. Here's another example. Assume that you are reading what appears to be a boring economics paper about the Irish overpopulation crisis of the 18th century. And yet, strangely enough, it seems to advocate for solving the dilemma by cooking and eating babies. That seems a bit cruel until you realize that you are, in fact, reading a modest proposal. To be clear, The Onion is not trying to compare itself to Jonathan Swift. Its writers are far more talented, and their output will be read long after that hack Swift has been lost to the sands of time. That's a funny, this is a funny line right here. This is good, by the way. That's good parody. They nailed it. Still, The Onion and its writers share with Swift the common goal of replicating a form precisely in order to critique it from within. That leverage of form, the mimicry of a particular idiom in order to heighten dissonance between form and consent, is what generates parody's rhetorical power. Parody needs to mimic an original to make its point. If parody did not deliver that advantage, then no one would use it. Everyone would simply draft straight, logical, uninspiring legal briefs instead. Good line. Good line. Because parody mimics the real thing, it has a unique capacity to critique the real thing. Importantly, parody provides functionality and value to a writer or a social commentator that might not be possible by, say, simply stating a critique outright and avoiding all the confusion of readers mistaking it for the real deal. One of parody's most powerful capacities is rhetorical. It gives people the ability to mimic the voice of a serious authority, whether that's the dry newspeak of the Associated Press or the legalese of a court's majority opinion, and thereby kneecap the authority from within. Parodists can take apart an authoritarian's cult of personality, point out the rhetorical tricks that politicians use to mislead their constituents, and even undercut a government institution's real-world attempts at propaganda. Again, citing Farah, noting that the point of parody is to censure the vices, follies, abuses, or shortcomings of an individual or society. Time and again, that's what has occurred with The Onion's news stories. In 2012, for example, The Onion proclaimed that Kim Jong-un was the sexiest man alive. Kim Jong-un named The Onion sexiest man alive for 2012. China's state-run news agency republished The Onion story as true alongside a slideshow of the dictator himself in all of his glory. That's amazing. The Fars Iranian news agency uncritically picked up and ran with The Onion's headline, Gallup poll, rural whites prefer Ahmadinejad to Obama. But that's probably also true. That's fine. I'm with it. Domestically, the number of elected leaders who are still incapable of parsing The Onion's coverage of satire is daunting. But one particular example stands out. Republican Congressman John Fleming, who believed that he needed to warn his constituents of a dangerous escalation of the pro-choice movement after reading The Onion's headline, Planned Parenthood opens $8 billion abortion plex. Ah, damn it. The point of all this, I hate, like, the Onion's not supposed to be funny. They've been saving it all. Like, they've been charging it up in their balls for one ejaculative moment, and they put it into this brief. The point of all this is not that it is funny when deluded figures of authority mistake satire for the actual news, even though that can be extremely funny. Rather, it's that the parody allows these figures to puncture their own sense of self-importance by falling for what any reasonable person would recognize as an absurd escalation of their own views. In the political context, the effect can be particularly pronounced. See Hustler Magazine versus Falwell and Falwell versus Flint. Oh, great cases, by the way. Wilkinson Justice, dissenting from denial of rehearing. Nothing is more thoroughly democratic than to have the high and mighty lampooned and spoofed. What a great case Hustler versus Falwell is, and Falwell versus Flint. A reasonable reader does not need a disclaimer to know that parody is parody. At bottom, parody functions by catering to a reasonable reader, one who can tell, even after being tricked at first, that the parody is not real. If most readers of parody didn't live up to this robust standard, then there would be nothing funny about the Chinese government believing that a pudgy dictator like Kim Jong-un was the sexiest man on earth. Everyone would just agree that it was perfectly reasonable for them to be taken in by the headline. The law turns on the same reasonable person construct. This is smart, by the way. So just as a background for this brief, the brief was drafted by lawyers on the legal aspect, and then Onion writers came in and helped them with the jokes. That's what happened here. They talked about it in the New York Times article, but I don't want to fucking waste everybody's time with the article. This thing is great. And but yeah, they sprinkled the jokes in to elevate the brief. The reasonable reader test gauges whether a statement can reasonably be interpreted as stating actual facts, thereby ensuring that neither the least humorous nor the most credulous audience dictates the boundaries of protected speech. A parody enjoys First Amendment protection, notwithstanding that everybody will get the joke. And the reasonable reader is no dullard. He or she dullard. Back to Maddox days. He or she does not represent the lowest common denominator, but reasonable intelligence and learning. He or she can tell the difference between satire and sincerity. New York Times versus Isaac, quoting Patrick's versus Superior Court. Nor is the reasonable person some totally humorless drudge who cannot perceive the presence of subtle invective. Instead, the reasonable reader's perspective is more informed by an assessment of her well-considered view than by her immediate yet transitory reaction, particularly in light of the special characteristics of satire, which leverages that transitory reaction for rhetorical effect. So that's weirdly worded, but what they're basically saying is the initial reaction to parody is not the answer. The well-considered reader's initial reaction is the same as everybody else. They're fooled. But a well-considered reader reads on, thinks about it, and goes, oh, this is fucking stupid and crazy. I was had by a joke. Okay. It was too silly to be true. And so therefore, it's not true. And it's that reaction that matters, not the first one. Because the first one is, oh, gotcha. And the second one is important. Context matters, but even a poorly executed parody is ordinarily susceptible to the intellectual grasp of the reasonable reader. See Gulliver's Travels in A Tale of a Tub from aforementioned hack and rejected Onion freelancer Jonathan Swift. Reasonable readers do not need to be told explicitly what they have no serious trouble figuring out for themselves. And until the Sixth Circuit's decision, that is what most courts have held. Some courts have expressly held that disclaimers aren't required for parody to be protected. Campbell, for example, noted that there is no reason to require parody to state the obvious. Cliff Notes Inc. versus Bantam Doubleday, Dell Publishing Group, says there is no requirement that the cover of a parody carry a disclaimer that it is not produced by the subject of the parody, and we ought not find such a requirement. Other courts have held that parody published without a disclaimer is nonetheless protected speech. For example, in NYSE versus Gahary, the district court found it entirely plausible that no one in their right mind would believe that the defendant, who posted obscene and vulgar messages online under the persona Richard Grasso, was the real-life Richard Grasso, the CEO of the New York Stock Exchange. That guy's a hero. The court in New Times similarly rejected the notion that the absence of a disclaimer was dispositive, noting that the reasonable reader had other obvious clues that an article was parody when it was reported that a 6-year-old girl was being prosecuted for her book report on Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, and included a photo of a small child holding a stuffed animal captioned, "Do they make handcuffs this small? Be afraid of this little girl." Citing Patrick, no reasonable reader would have been deceived by a memorandum purportedly written by a judge that declared a certain legal newspaper contraband, announced a chambers by chambers search for copies of the publication, advised fellow judges and employees to conduct their amorous escapades elsewhere while the search was being conducted, and declared the judge's intent to suspend the election of his successor and remain in office indefinitely. In this case, by contrast, the Sixth Circuit ruled that the defendant officers could reasonably believe that some of Novak's Facebook activity was not parody, primarily because Mr. Novak deleted comments that made clear the page was fake. So the guy's going through, people are like, fake page, fake page. So he goes and deletes them. They're like, oh my God, that means he means it's true. Just to be clear, this was not a close call on the facts. Mr. Novak's spoof Facebook post advertised that the Parma Police Department was hosting a pedophile reform event in which successful participants could be removed from the sex offender registry and be honorary members of the department after completing puzzles and quizzes. That's great. That the department had discovered an experimental technique for abortions and would be providing them to teens for free in a police van. That the department was soliciting job applicants, but that minorities were strongly encouraged not to apply. And the department was banning city residents from feeding homeless people in an attempt to have the homeless population eventually leave our city due to starvation. All of those are good jokes. All of those are good fucking jokes. That's perfect. True, not all humor is equally transcendent, but the quality and taste of parody is irrelevant. Really fucking important. Really fucking important. I would replace parody with comedy, but it's true for parody, it's true for comedy, it's true for speech. The quality and taste of speech is irrelevant, and this is the hardest part of freedom. It's the hardest part of liberty. See Hustler, Pring versus Penthouse International, extending First Amendment protections to a parody that had no redeeming features, whatever. And there's no real doubt that reasonable readers would have no difficulty in ascertaining that Parma's finest were not actually providing free abortions to teens in a police van, pardoning child sex offenders on the basis of their adeptness at puzzles, or intentionally starving the homeless. The absence of a disclaimer lends nothing to the analysis. Under a proper understanding of the reasonable reader test, a disclaimer not only spoils the punchline, but is redundant. The Sixth Circuit's holding stands alone among the otherwise uniform approach courts have taken, and not in a good way. Section 4, it should be obvious that parodists cannot be prosecuted for telling a joke with a straight face. This is the 15th page of a convoluted legal filing intended to deconstruct. Look at this. This is brilliant. Intended to deconstruct the societal implications of parody, so the reader's attention is almost certainly wandering. That's understandable. So here's a paragraph of gripping legal analysis to ensure that every jurist who reads this brief is appropriately impressed by the logic of its argument and the lucidity of its prose. Bona vacantia, de bonis aspertatis, writ of certiorari, de minimis, jus accrescendi, forum non conveniens, corpus juris ad hominem tu cocae, post hoc ergo propter hoc, quod est demonstratum, actus reus, scandalum magnatum, pactum reservati domini. See what happened? This brief itself went from a discussion of parody's function and the quite serious historical and legal arguments in favor of strong protections for parodic speech to a curveball mocking the way legalese can be both impenetrably boring and belie the hollowness of a legal position. That's the setup and punchline idea again. It would not have worked quite as well if this brief had said the following: hello there, reader. We are about to write an amicus brief about the value of parody, buckle up because we're going to be doing some fairly ultra things, including commenting on the text form itself. Nailed it. Nailed it. Really, really smart. Taking the latter route would have spoiled the joke and come off as more than a bit stodgy. But more importantly, it would have disarmed the power that comes with a form devouring itself. For millennia, this has been the rhythm of parody. The author convinces the readers that they're reading the real thing, then pulls the rug out from under them with a joke. The heart of this form lies in that give and take between the serious setup and the ridiculous punchline. As Mark Twain puts it, the humorous story is told gravely. The teller does his best to conceal the fact that he even dimly suspects there's anything funny about it. Citing Mark Twain, How to Tell a Story. Not only is the Sixth Circuit on the wrong side of Twain, but grafting onto the reasonable reader test a requirement that parodists explicitly disclaim their own pretense to reality is a disservice to the American public. It assumes that ordinary readers are less sophisticated and more humorless than they actually are. And the stakes here are significant. Let's go back to that line for just a second. It assumes that ordinary readers are less sophisticated and more humorless than they actually are. And you have just described the current climate on political discourse. You've just described every single person who goes to a Dave Chappelle show and complains. You've just described every single angry person on Twitter. That they act more humorless and less sophisticated than they actually are. And they do it. Many of them are doing it intentionally. But that's the rub, right? They're doing it for their cause, not because they're stupid. It's a lie. The reality is these people laugh, they smile, they smirk, they chuckle at comedy just like everybody else. And if you want proof of it, just install a hidden camera in some staunch Christian's home and watch them laugh at a fart joke that comes across their like Christian cable news network animated show or whatever. Because everybody laughs at a fart joke eventually. It's a rule of physics. It's going to happen. It doesn't matter who these people pretend to not find jokes funny because they need the outrage. And they need the virtue. They need the signal. They need to project a thing, but it's not real. The cops knew this wasn't real. Cops weren't fooled. Cops didn't think that this guy was actually interfering with police business. They got the joke. They didn't like it. They were butthurt. If it was another department than their own, they would have laughed. Because of course you would have laughed. That's the danger of satire. That's the reality of parody. Parody is you'll always laugh when it's someone else, but it's really uncomfortable when it's you. It's really uncomfortable when someone has ripped you apart with parody. Because it does expose all of your weaknesses, all of your flaws, all of the tricks and shortcuts that you rely on to deliver your message. Pokes a hole in him, and it laughs at the farting sound of the balloon as it flies around the room. Because farts are funny. But that's parody. They've nailed it. Like this is, you don't get legal briefs like this. And I hate to praise The Onion because I think they're a bunch of just chumps. And the stakes here are significant, involving no less than one of many more or less equally important components of social and political discourse. Rhetorical hyperbole has traditionally added much to the discourse of our nation, Milkovich, although cited 497 US at 20 and then cleaned up in the parenthetical. Because sometimes, so this is a deep lawyer joke, but when you have these citations that like cite other cases, which then have a C also to another case, which then favorably talk about something and then eventually have a quote, you have like these multi-depth citations that go on in parentheticals forever. It's just cleaned up. Although quote, parody is often offensive, it is nevertheless deserving of substantial freedom, both as entertainment and as a form of social and literary criticism. L.L. Bean versus Drake Publishers. This court has traditionally been hesitant to chill speech. They're appealing right to John Roberts here, by the way. John Roberts has been very strong on speech, the only good thing he's done. This court has traditionally been hesitant to chill speech, and the prospect of chilling parody by imprisoning its practitioners provides equal cause for caution. More cause for caution, frankly, but you can go with equal, I guess. Quote, what may be difficult to communicate or understand when factually reported may be poignant and powerful if offered in satire. Rogers versus Grimaldi back in 1988. Quote, the last thing we need, the last thing the First Amendment will tolerate is a law that lets public figures keep people from mocking them. Cartoons versus Major League Baseball players, quoting White versus Samsung Electronics. And what a truth this is. This is freedom versus dictator versus tyrant, a law that lets public figures keep people from mocking them. Because at the end of the day, it's their egos. It's their egos on trial by parody. And we know you don't enter public discourse, and you certainly don't enter public service without a little bit of ego and a whole shitload of narcissism. The Onion intends to continue its socially valuable role, bringing the disinfectant of sunlight into the halls of power. See Buckley versus Vallejo, quoting Louis D. Brandeis, Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It, National Home Library Foundation. And it would vastly prefer that sunlight not to be measured out to its riders in 15-minute increments in an exercise yard. Conclusion, the petition for cert should be granted, the rights of the people vindicated, and various historical wrongs remedied. The Onion would welcome any one of the three, particularly the first. Respectfully submitted. Stephen J. Van Stempvoort, Council of Record. D. Andrew Portinga, phenomenal. Like legitimately funny, entertaining, engaging, legally correct, morally precise, and in full support of freedom for 1 fucking minute. The Onion did it right.
So pour out an odd bag of Balmore and Lafroig. Spirits flow as the ones who get unemployed. So pour out a glass for the team post on Twitter as we hear Lost Painting tonight. From the white shores of Nairn to the hills of Glenlivet, there's no one who explains the wrong better than Nick. So pour